February 10, 1943. Imperial General Headquarters, Tokyo. The evacuation from Guadalcanal had just been completed, and in the dim light of winter, the army officers who filed into conference rooms at Ichigaya and the Prime Minister's office understood, some for the first time and others with a quiet dread, that the war was sliding into a new phase. The code name for the withdrawal, Operation K, sounded brisk and clinical on paper, but the faces around the table made it plain. The grinding American presence had proven impossible to dislodge. The logistics that fed it stretched far beyond what the Japanese army had prepared to meet, and the arithmetic of power steel, oil, ships, aircraft, trained men rotating home to train more was tilting decisively. When these generals spoke in meetings and in memoranda after February 1943, their language grew less about rapid strokes and more about holding ground, conserving cartridges, and bleeding an adversary that by sheer productive force was becoming a storm that would not pass. In the months that followed, officers in Tokyo and Rabaul compared notes that differed in details but converged on a single conclusion. American power had matured into a system rather than a series of isolated thrusts. Reports from New Guinea described how American engineers carved airfields out of jungle at a pace the staff had not imagined, with roadways layered behind the runways and supply dumps stacked in tidy rows that refilled as if by magic. A brigadier returning from the Southwest Pacific tried to capture the feeling without purple words. Enemy aircraft appeared in squadrons that were not simply numerous but fresh, as if the planes that landed at dusk were already replaced by new ones at dawn. In the old planning offices of the Army General Staff, where maps of the southern resources area still hung like talismans of an early war dream, officers who had once predicted that America's distance would cripple it now spoke in clipped sentences about convoy cycles, amphibious training centers, and the rhythm of carriers appearing, striking, and vanishing over the horizon. Even before the summer of 1944 delivered its decisive shocks, the core of the Japanese army's analysis was taking shape. The United States had turned its economy into a logistics machine, and the machine was now dictating the battlefield. The first way generals expressed this was in the language of shipping. Army transport officers had been warning since late 1942 that the attrition of merchant LS under submarine attack and from airstrikes threatened the sustenance of garrisons from the Solomons to the Gilberts. But it was after Guadalcanal that their warnings hardened into a repeated refrain in staff meetings. Our formations must learn to live on the land itself, because the sea is no longer ours at night, and never ours by day. Major generals attached to the Southern Army summarized it more bluntly to their superiors in Tokyo. The Americans can replace ships faster than we can sink them, and they can sink ships faster than we can replace them. That insight, stated without drama, was a wedge that pried open others. Once the sea lanes were increasingly lethal for Japanese transports, the Army's old concept of a mobile island-hopping counterattack lost shape. Defensive perimeters became static out of necessity, not doctrine. Garrisons were planted with the hope that some would be bypassed, but others would impose a price high enough to slow the American tide. The men who authored these changes rarely spoke of defeat. They spoke, instead of protracting the decisive stage, of creating conditions favorable to negotiation, and threaded, beneath these euphemisms, a steel-wire admission. The enemy's factories were deciding the length of the war. When the Central Pacific erupted in 1944, Army generals stationed in the Philippines, the Marianas, and on Formosa sent back observations that read like echoes. In June, as American carrier task forces struck Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, Army officers on the islands who had trained to repel landings with aggressive counterattacks found that attack was less a choice than a suicide note. The pre-landing bombardments pulverized communications and supply caches with a weight and accuracy that stunned even veterans of the China front. One lieutenant general remarked in a situation report that the Americans fought with a rhythm: fighters suppressing airfields, dive bombers flattening fixed guns, ships pounding suspected batteries in methodical belts. Then waves of landing craft that seemed to grow rather than shrink as casualties mounted. What made that rhythm unbearable, he added, was that it could be repeated the next day, and the next, as if the enemy fleet were not a fleet at all, but an assembly line. On the staff side, generals in Tokyo studied combat narratives from the Marianas and made a hard pivot. The orders drafted in the last week of June 1944 for Luzon and for the defense of the southern approaches emphasized digging, dispersion, and an economy of fire that would have been unthinkable early in the war. The army did not use the language of despair. Soldiers were instructed to preserve bullets for decisive range, to conserve mortar for night counterattacks at short distances, to avoid exposing positions before the full landing, and to abandon any expectation of air cover unless surprise is obtained. Reading between the lines, every colonel understood the subtext. Air superiority belonged to the Americans by default. Senior generals had begun to say it out loud in private. We will not recover control of the air or sea in this war. The Americans had set up machine-like training pipelines that kept carrier decks crowded with pilots. They had created advanced bases where wounded men were evacuated and replaced before the Japanese even knew a unit had been hurt. They had logistics units, which, by American design, made operations possible without pauses, that the Imperial General Headquarters had counted on. In the Philippines campaign that opened in the fall of 1944, these judgments became flesh. Generals watching from Luzon and Leyte admitted, in sober language that left no escape hatch, that the American joint effort was not just stronger, but also integrated in a way the Japanese system could not mirror. Artillery, naval gunfire, and tactical aviation cooperated to such a degree that Japanese battalion commanders found their usual tricks: concealment, sudden flanking moves, night thrusts met by an enemy that refused to exhaust itself or lose contact. A senior general in Manila, reflecting on reports from Leyte before the siege of the capital began, noted that when American units stumbled, they were rarely isolated. Behind them moved rivers of trucks and bulldozers, radio vans and field kitchens, and, above all, plans for tomorrow that seemed not to depend on how much blood had been spent today. That quality, he concluded, had nothing to do with legend and everything to do with organization. An organization was a power as decisive as steel. There were still voices of defiance, and they mattered. But even those voices were laced with an appraisal of American capacity that bordered on fatalism. When Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita took command in the Philippines, his idea of defense in depth and economy of force was not simply a tactical innovation. It was an acknowledgement that facing American power head-on guaranteed annihilation without effect. The infamous bayonet charges that had seemed to have meaning in China or Malaya were forbidden. Positions would be hidden in the hills. Ammunition would be rationed, as if there were no resupply, because, practically speaking, there would not be. Counterattacks would be launched only to restore a crumbling line, or to buy time for an orderly retreat into the interior. Read carefully. Yamashita's directives were a kind of commentary on the enemy's power. He had to make American strength irrelevant by denying it targets worth the expenditure. In the Bonin Islands, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi's policy for Iwo Jima spoke the same language from a different rock. The defensive network he designed, with interlocking bunkers, camouflaged artillery, and a ban on premature engagement reflected a view formed in late 1944. American naval gunfire and carrier aviation were so overwhelming that any sign of life before the landing would trigger a tidal response. The only way to harm the Americans at all, Kuribayashi believed, was to survive the storm, force them into hand-to-hand fighting in a landscape of tunnels, and deny them the instant victory that their firepower promised. He did not write in melodrama. His view was clinical. The United States could replace ships, planes, and men faster than Japan could replace rifles. The only lever left was time, and time would only lengthen if shooters stayed silent until the enemy had no choice but to come within reach. Back in Tokyo, the highest councils of the army wrestled with the only grand strategy that made sense inside these constraints. By the start of 1945, after the B-29s had begun to lift off from the Marianas to strike the home islands, generals with responsibility for homeland defense no longer pretended that the country's cities were safe or that the army could interrupt the American bombing tempo. Instead, their memoranda adopted a new rhythm: disperse factories, move machine tools underground where possible, accept that production will fall, and train militia formations to add flesh to the coastal lines. The phrase decisive battle remained in the paperwork, a ritual formula that gestured at a dramatic clash, but the accompanying schedules were all about famine, fortification, and endurance. Even the choice of words, attrition of enemy will, was a quiet admission that the enemy's power was not going to run out. The best Japan could hope for, the generals now said when they yanked the door shut and let the minutes rest in a drawer, was to impose a cost high enough to change the political calculus in Washington. When the firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 made the air war's power tangible to every office in the capital, Army officers' private remarks took on a stark tone. The B-29 formations were no longer an abstraction in staff pamphlets. They were a weekly visitation that burned neighborhoods the Army would later need to feed and shelter the very soldiers it was training to repel landings. The reports from district commanders were grim and practical. Water mains melted, fire breaks failed, command posts lost telephone exchange. Replacement pumps were scarce, and all of it was happening faster than the Army's repair units could respond. It was not a question of individual courage. In fact, many generals noted that American pilots over the home islands were increasingly efficient rather than ferocious. They flew their routes with a precision that said more about maintenance and planning than about fury. The power that the Army could not ignore was administrative as much as explosive. On Okinawa, which the Army had prepared to turn into a lesson for the invader, the generals witnessed at close range the fullest expression of American combined arms they had ever faced. They had dug cave systems, laid interlocking fields of fire, and stocked the ridges with mortar counted shell by shell, because the sea lanes were lethal. In the first days of April 1945, American troops came ashore under the screen of ships that fired until their barrels glowed. Overhead, planes cycled in shifts that looked, to observers on the ground, like a factory's shift change. What struck the Japanese officers who wrote the post-action notes was not merely the violence, but the system that sustained it. Wounded men vanished into hospital ships and returned to the theater. Replacement units arrived already acclimated to the climate and to the units they would join. Supply columns moved under an umbrella of air supremacy that reduced the Japanese counterattack to sniping. The single bright spot, the ability of kamikaze attacks to knock out ships, flickered amid the larger darkness. Each aircraft sent on a one-way mission was an irreplaceable machine and an irreplaceable pilot, while the enemy seemed able to pull new holes and new flyers from a reserve that did not diminish. These experiences flowed back to Tokyo, into the planning concept the Army called Ketsugo, the defense of the home islands. Generals in the Homeland Defense General Headquarters began to phrase their instructions with an unvarnished clarity. Assume no sea control, assume no air control, and assume the enemy's ability to mobilize fresh amphibious forces repeatedly. The decisive factor, they cautioned corps and division commanders, would be the ability to assemble force quickly at the chosen landing beaches despite bombardment, to hold fire until the Americans entered killing zones, and to preserve ammunition for tactical nodes, bridges, road junctions, and command radios rather than for theatrical gestures. It was a radical thing for an army that had built part of its martial identity around shock and audacity to speak so much of restraint. But restraint, to these generals, was the only way to extract meaning from the enemy's strength. The words that peppered their final plan's economy, dispersion, camouflage, delay, were the vocabulary of a professional corps that had measured itself against an adversary now operating at industrial scale. When they looked for causes, the Army's senior officers did not all agree. Some blamed the lack of jointness with the Navy, whose carriers and fuel would, in theory, have shielded supply runs and allowed the Army to maneuver at scale. Some looked backward to the China War and argued that the Army had trained itself to solve operational problems by attacking faster and farther, in a theater where the enemy's air and sea power were small. When that habit met an enemy with boundless gas and holes, it produced plans that collapsed upon contact. Many were candid about the human material. The Americans rotated units, invested in maintaining the health of their soldiers, and sent their wounded home to become instructors. Their entire system produced competence and propagated it. Japan, fighting a total war with a smaller industrial base and a tightening ring round it. lacked the slack in its system to smooth error and replenish expertise. The general officers who said these things did not often say them for the record, but they said them enough that their staffers wrote them into files where younger officers could read and absorb. Yet, despite the accumulation of such sober judgments, the army was not paralyzed. It found in the very fact of American power a reason to clarify the purpose of each defensive battle. Generals in Manchuria, in Kyushu, and in the coastal districts conferred with their intelligence sections and insisted on realistic estimates, no fantasies about surprising a fleet, no illusions about massed tank battles unsupported by fuel. Their resolve did not come from belief that victory was at hand. It came from the conviction that even against a giant, skill and discipline mattered. Soldiers could be taught to fire only when their sights were true, to move at night, to keep a ration of explosives for a demolition that would truly hinder the enemy, rather than dramatize defiance. Each time a general signed an order worded in that vein, he was implicitly saying what the title of this story promises, that American power had become impossible to ignore, and that recognizing it was the first step to making whatever remained of Japanese power count for something. By the end of the summer of 1945, as meetings in Tokyo rooms grew shorter and the maps on the walls turned into abstracts of a homeland soon to be invaded, army generals spoke less of plans and more of thresholds, how much pain the enemy would bear, how much destruction the nation could endure, how many months could be bought by turning beaches into mazes. In those last councils, even the fiercest voices understood that the United States could keep coming as long as it chose to, and that Japan's fate hinged on changing that choice. The language of those officers, stripped of slogan and ceremony, offers a final, unblinking answer to what they said when American power could no longer be denied. They spoke of time, of cost, of ration and concealment. They admitted that enemy air and sea mastery was a constant like weather. They turned from dreaming up symmetrical battles to crafting ways to make asymmetry bite. They did not celebrate this turn. They accepted it, because by then acceptance was not surrender. It was the only route left to purpose under the crushing weight of a modern war machine. And yet even that acceptance had an ending. In August, when one shock followed another and the framework of Katsugo crumpled, a few generals still framed their statements in terms of calculation what might alas stand in Kyushu bias, in negotiation. But the soldiers in their districts could see the deeper truth in the generals. Drawn expressions as couriers brought the latest news. The enemy now wielded not just more of the same power, but a new kind. Air delivered and annihilating in a single instant. The vocabulary that had sustained staff work, tonnage, sortie rates, replacement schedules seemed suddenly small. After so many months of speaking with a professional respect about the enemy's immense capacity, many generals fell silent. What had been impossible to ignore had become impossible to match in any way. When the emperor's voice came over the radio, the generals reached for a different language at last, the language of survival and duty to a nation that would have to be rebuilt from ash. In their hearts they had been saying it for more than 2 years. The war against an America that had built an empire of production could only be endured, shaped, and ended, not won by contesting its strength directly. In February 1943, when the lights in Tokyo glowed dim and reports from the south piled on desks, the army's generals began to speak that truth to one another. By August 1945, it was the only truth left. The clearest gauge of how army generals adjusted their thinking after Guadalcanal was the way they rewrote the small print of orders sent to garrisons that could no longer expect rescue. On Bougainville and New Britain, staff officers who had once promised reinforcement in the language of certainty now used verbs like endure and evade. They stopped describing American attacks as occasional raids and began to define them as phases in a continuous pressure that would only thicken. A colonel who had sat through the early briefings in Tokyo remembered how, in 1942, the assumption had been that American distance would fracture their supply chain. By 1943, he heard major generals talk as if American distance had become a coil spring, storing energy in depots, ships, and airfields until it was released in synchronized blows. The officers did not suddenly become poets. They became record keepers of a hard fact. The war had shifted from a contest of daring to a contest of systems, and the American system was accelerating. In Rabaul, where the Army's strength had been knitted to the Navy's ambitions, the change of tone was almost tactile. Officers who watched the Americans bypass strongpoints instead of battering them learned to read the map in a new way. The places that were not attacked became proof of enemy strength rather than mercy, because the bypassed islands were transformed into traps for their own garrisons. No shipping, no air cover, no practical line of retreat. Generals charged with defending the Solomons drew the hardest conclusion any field commander can draw. Their mission was no longer to preserve a force for later maneuver. It was to preserve a force long enough to burden the enemy's timeline. From that time forward, surviving for 30 days inside an American perimeter counted as success at the scale of grand strategy. New Guinea amplified the lesson. Here the Army faced not just a fleet's hammer, but a methodical land advance sustained by engineers, who seemed to carry a road in their pockets. Generals who toured the front lines saw American units carve airstrips, then pull up fuel, munitions, and prefabricated buildings as if the jungle were a blank page and their pencils were sharp. A staff memorandum from the theater compressed the new reality into a few sentences. If the enemy wants an airfield, he will build it. If he wants a port, he will make one. If he wants a road, he will lay it. The Army had men of courage and skill, but it did not have a tool to undo the enemy's ability to turn wilderness into infrastructure almost overnight. That truth forced a change in the way firepower was allocated. Units were told to conserve artillery until intercepting American columns at night, or in terrain where bulldozers could not follow. Every shell had to purchase delay. Anything less was waste. Behind the lines, in Tokyo rooms where maps never smelled of mud, generals absorbed the front's vocabulary of attrition and turned it into doctrine. The older dream that a bold counterstroke might shatter American morale gave way to a stricter arithmetic. Americans replaced divisions with cadres and training pipelines. They rotated exhausted formations to fresh bases and fed them rest, replacements, and equipment. They treated logistics as a living organism that learned with each operation. The Japanese Army had doctrine and valor, but it lacked the slack to recover from mistakes at the rate the enemy did. Staff officers began to write with a cooler kind of pride, the pride of professionals who adjust to reality. They no longer promised to roll back enemy gains. They promised to exact payment in days and weeks. When the Marianas became the gravitational center of the war in mid-1944, the Army confronted a revelation that was as much psychological as tactical. It had the form of repetition. Every day the sky filled with American planes. Every day the sea line of horizon shimmered with ships. Every day, after bombardments and brief pauses, came more landing craft. Generals who had timed their counterattacks by the enemy's visible exhaustion found no such clock to read. The enemy did not pause for the reasons they expected. He paused to align schedules. That distinction reached Tokyo with the force of a doctrinal earthquake. In the days that followed, the language of field instruction changed. Concealment was no longer merely a virtue. It was the precondition for existence. Positions would be built deep, connected by tunnels, sited in slopes that hid them from direct naval fire. Radios would be rationed not by messages, but by hours of life. Batteries were ammunition. A regiment that lived to dawn on the 7th day of an assault was a strategic instrument. That reorientation touched everything, even the Army's sense of its relationship to the Navy. In early war briefings, the Army had trusted that the Navy's heavy ships and carriers would contest sea control long enough for Army garrisons to concentrate for counterattack. By 1944, generals writing their instructions to island commands did not assume friendly sea power at all. They assumed the opposite. The Navy, straining under its own losses and a shrinking fuel supply, would fight where it could, but the Army must behave as if the ocean around every island were hostile all the time. That assumption simplified planning in a grim way. It meant supply by submarine would be rare and erratic. It meant food, water, and ammunition had to be sourced locally or stored with a miser's discipline. It meant that every bomb crater that held rain was a cistern, and every cave had to be sized not just for soldiers, but for the barrels and crates that would make their presence meaningful. In the Philippines, where the Army had hoped for an opportunity to fuse geographic depth with urban defense, The generals found the enemy's rhythm again and recognized its source. Air superiority was not a winged abstraction. It was a schedule. American pilots fought in shifts. Replacement aircraft arrived before old ones wore out. Maintenance happened out of sight, in places protected by anti-aircraft belts and fighter cover that did not thin as the campaign lengthened. When Japanese officers wrote of this schedule, they were not trying to abstract away the human element of battle. They were noticing the enemy's habit of never exhausting a unit to the point of failure without a plan to knit it back together. The Americans did not fight like gamblers, they fought like engineers. Under that kind of pressure, improvisation could still win a skirmish, but it could not change a campaign. The general's private comments after the loss of Leyte intensified the new realism. They had studied American amphibious training with admiration and dread. They knew the sequence by heart: reconnaissance, bombardment, fighter sweeps, suppression of airfields, ship-to-shore movement, protected by smoke and air. Then combat engineers who turned beaches into roads. The part they had underestimated was the depth of the American bench. When a beachhead stuttered, the Americans simply widened it. When a bridge went down, they erected a better one. When a unit took losses, a new one arrived that already knew the terrain because its planners had modeled the ground weeks earlier. The Japanese army had skill at infiltration and night movement. It knew how to turn hills into fortresses, but it lacked a way to interrupt the enemy's learning process. Generals began to talk about the war, not as a series of battles, but as a conveyor belt. A belt must be jammed, not opposed piece by piece. That thought underwrote the order that now governed every defensive plan. Hold fire until the enemy cannot avoid exposure. Then spend ammunition for effect, not for display. No area exposed the imbalance as painfully as the sea lanes. The army owed its food and bullets to ships it did not command. And those ships' merchantmen with slow lines and thin escorts had become prey. American submarines stalked them, and American planes pounced when convoys entered range. Army generals devoted memos to the problem as if words could conjure steel. But beneath the acronyms and polite requests lay the knowledge that each sunk transport hollowed out a garrison that would never be relieved. Even the best prepared units were forced to think like survivalists. One division commander on an island far from rescue turned his engineers into gardeners, and his gardeners into engineers. Another raided the island's own history for survival skills, taking note of how pre-war settlers had caught water, cured fish, and dug cool storage pits. These measures were not romantic. They were admissions of defeat at sea, couched as fieldcraft. The army did not forget the sea. It learned to pretend for a while that it did not exist. If generals could have chosen their battlefield, they might have chosen hills and cities, where blood buys time. Okinawa offered both, and it became a demonstration both of what the army could still do, and of what the enemy could always do more of. The plan for defense there showed the maturity of the new doctrine: layered positions, deliberate withdrawals, the careful husbanding of mortar and machine gun belts for defined arcs. The initial days in April 1945 looked, on paper, like proof that the method could work. The Americans landed with little opposition. The defenders stayed silent. Then, as the enemy advanced into the lattice of caves and slopes, the fire fell with purpose. Yet even as the Japanese inflicted losses, even as the names of ridges became testaments to resistance, the enemy's system kept its shape. Sea power meant batteries were resupplied. Air power meant the defenders' movements were observed and punished. Medical power meant wounded Americans turned into convalescents, and convalescents into returnees or teachers. The Japanese generals who read the daily tallies knew that courage was not enough to reverse such arithmetic. They told their subordinates, in the disciplined voice of professionals, to continue the method. Engage at decisive distances, then disappear, then... They knew disappearance would not become invulnerability, but it was the only currency left that could be exchanged for time. In the home islands, the Army's senior staff crafted Katsugo with the candor that only men braced for catastrophe can achieve. They assigned priorities not by prestige, but by prediction. If the Americans landed first in Kushua's, countless analysts concluded the Army would focus training, food, and ammunition there. The logic was No unit elsewhere would be starved to death on paper for the sake of symmetry. Generals signed orders that elevated camouflage to an operational art and dispersion to a creed. They still invoked decisive battle, because ritual words carry duty forward. But their schedules betrayed what their hearts had learned. They made lists of shovels and wire, of rails and spikes for roadblocks. They demanded logs for anti-landing stakes and gasoline for last resort fires. They argued about where to hide depots so that bombers would not discover them before the very moment they were to be used. They were not mistaken about the coming storm. They expected it to arrive on a date someone might someday calculate from captured calendars and supply charts. What they could not compute was how many weeks or months they could purchase with flesh and grit. So they designed every trench to make the exchange rate as favorable as reality allowed. A subject that crept into more meetings than outsiders would guess was training. The army had not forgotten how to make soldiers. It had forgotten how to pause long enough to make them well. In the early years of the war, units accumulated their shrewd non-commissioned officers through a kind of natural selection that required time to take effect. By 1944 to 45, time had become a currency the army did not control. Generals who had grown up worshipping minute planning lamented privately that they were now drafting instructions for men who would fight with days of training rather than months. They adjusted the content, stripping it to essentials that fit the new doctrine. Fire only when it counts. Move only when you must. Dig always. Communicate in brevity. Hoard grenades for night. Map your field of fire in daylight with stones and sticks and then memorize it. They knew the Americans trained on a deeper scale. They could not match that depth, so they traded breadth for focus. A soldier who obeyed 5 rules well could be more valuable than a soldier who faintly remembered 15. Another theme came to dominate the way generals spoke about the enemy: maintenance. This sounds like a shop floor word, not a battlefield word, but it lived in the spaces between American operations. Engines stayed healthy. Weapons were cleaned and replaced, not when they broke, but on a schedule. Tires and tracks reached landing beaches in numbers that did not leave gaps. Field kitchens appeared so reliably that the enemy fought fed rather than merely hungry. Japanese generals did not envy the comfort. They envied the practicality. A fed soldier can be marched and asked to solve problems. A hungry one burns his thoughts on calories. The army had taught itself to fight hungry when it had to. It had not built a system for keeping hunger from becoming the constant state. In their post-action reviews, staff officers flagged maintenance whenever they could. They told their own quartermasters to think like mechanics, not miracle workers. The instruction was sound, and often hopeless, because sound instruction cannot reverse the loss of factories and fuel. At the same time, general officers were peering outward at the enemy's command. Relationships and drawing conclusions that pinched Americans quarreled. 2. No coalition fights without argument. But the quarrels did not often crack the surface of operations. To the Japanese eye, the enemy's navy and army whose mandarins wore different uniforms and spoke different dialects of doctrines presented to the battlefield a single face. That unity made their blows land together. The Japanese army, tied to a navy that was bleeding its last capital, could not promise the same harmony. In moments of private honesty, generals admitted that their own service quarrels had been luxuries they could no longer afford. Yet they had been paid for and could not be refunded. They performed a last service by refusing to let their bitterness reach the lines. The soldiers under their orders had enough to carry. If one listens for what generals actually said, rather than what later legend puts in their mouths, a certain modesty appears. They did not deliver impassioned speeches about doom. They delivered instructions about angles and ranges. They left the rhetoric of destiny to those who needed it. To the officers trained to count and measure, the declaration that American power had become impossible to ignore did not come as a single epiphany. It arrived like dawn through thin curtains, growing brighter after each campaign until it became the room's ordinary light. They tightened their language when they spoke of it, and their words hardened into a liturgy. We will not command the sea. We will not command the air. We will conserve men and munitions. We will set ambushes in depth. We will build positions that cannot be read from the water. We will spend our volumes of fire on the day that matters. We will not be drawn into pointless show. The liturgy was not surrender. It was the last dignity left to a professional cause. For all that, there were still moments of defiance that bled upward into policy. Some generals believed that the psychological effect of kamikaze strikes warranted the irrecoverable cost. Others, even while acknowledging the temporary tactical shock of such attacks, calculated the exchange rate in units and cringed. They did not often commit their disagreement to permanent paper, but their orders revealed their bias. Where they believed cost could still be made to bite, they accepted it. Where it could not, they recommended silence rather than theatrical deaths. Silence became one of the army's strangest weapons, an absence of fire that forced the enemy to walk into ranges that made sense. It was the only weapon that could multiply itself at will, because it required nothing but discipline and planning. Generals who had grown up on charges learned late how to command stillness. The American bombing of the home islands, which had started with high-altitude pinpricks and became city-leveling conflagrations, converted abstract appreciation into an air thick with urgency. The army could not tell its countrymen that the sky would be protected. It could tell them that the ground would be contested when the enemy came. That shoveled promise settled into district commands as an operational reality. Generals assigned to coastal sectors counted ships on wall charts and then turned to the work of making villages into fortresses without turning them into graveyards before the hour came. It is easy, after the fact, to say that such work was futile. It did not feel futile to the men who signed the orders. It felt like turning arithmetic into duty. The officers knew the numbers would not smile. They wanted the numbers to frown for a while. In their final weeks before the end, when each day brought a fresh wound and a new instruction, the Army's seniors composed their sentences with an economy that matched the shortage of everything else. They cut adjectives the way they cut rations. They explained to field commanders that the enemy's strength would not break unless the enemy chose to break it, and that their job was to push at the hinge of that choice. The hinge, they believed, was cost and time. If American newspapers printed casualty lists that grew too long and calendars that stretched too far, perhaps the enemy's politics would crack before the army's trenches did. It was a hope, not a plan, and they knew the difference. Plans fill calendars. Hopes fill silence. As the war collapsed into its last events, hope had the louder voice. The generals answered it with the only language they trusted. Hold fire, hold ground, spend only when it buys time. Looking back across the arc, from February 1943 to the late summer of 1945, the portrait that emerges of Japanese army generals is not one of sudden enlightenment, but of steady recognition. Early bravado, where it existed, thinned out under reports that were too consistent to deny. A staff officer cannot argue with the same number reported by 10 different commands. Courage ceased to be the contested variable. The contested variable became the rate at which a vast opponent could convert resources into force. When the generals spoke of American power becoming impossible to ignore, they did not always use those words. They described sickeningly regular carriers and the cough of B-29s over their own roofs. They described piers that broke under keys of steel and then were reborn in a... They noted the habit of never fighting exhausted, of keeping food near men and fuel near machines. They described an enemy who built the conditions of victory before asking soldiers to secure it. Those descriptions, in their dryness, tell the tale more honestly than any lyric could. It is tempting to imagine some dramatic council where a single general pounded a table and declared the truth aloud. The record shows something quieter and more professional. A doctrine evolved, an army adjusted. Men trained differently. Orders were written with defensive wisdom that would have honored any staff college in any era. The facts that overwhelmed that wisdom, the sinking of ships faster than they could be launched, the domination of sky and sea by a fleet that learned while it fought, the replacement of loss with fresh strength, as if pain were a mere business process, do not diminish the general's craft. They define its limits. Professionals draw lines around possibility and then perform within them. Japan's army in the last 2.5 years of the war did not lack professionals. It lacked time, fuel, steel, and the luxury of forgiving errors. American power took those away. The generals, in the end, said so, not with speeches, then with the instructions that made their soldiers' last stands costly, their withdrawals orderly, and their refusals to waste ammunition a form of honor. When the end came, the new kind of power that appeared in August did not so much change those judgments as erase the margins where doubt had scattered. It made plain what had already become a daily confession in Tokyo, and in every battered headquarters the enemy's reach now exceeded the vocabulary the army had spent 3 years refining. There was, for a moment, a hush in which all the professional language of economy and concealment felt like tools nobody would need until a different world arrived. The generals accepted that the war had to stop, not because their method had lost its internal logic, but because the external universe had shifted. They had already measured themselves against a giant and learned to land pinpricks that bled time. Now there was no time left to buy. When the voice of the emperor asked for silence, they did not argue. They had been practicing that skill in the face of American power for a long while. In that final quiet, the truest thing they had been saying since. Guadalcanal still held its shape. The United States had made war into a system that could not be It could only be outlasted if the system itself chose to rest, and it never did. The generals who had watched the war bend after Guadalcanal also left behind a quieter record of what they believed would matter long after the noise stopped. What officers should learn from a strong enemy that builds power like an engineer, not like a gambler. The lessons appear in the way they taught younger staff to write orders with verbs that describe effects rather than emotions, to measure anything that can be measured, and to strip away the hope that a single stroke might reverse months of arithmetic. This was not despair. It was the adult recognition that the opponent's endurance was manufactured ahead of time. In conversations recorded after the war by interrogators, and in the memory of staff who survived, the refrain recurs. The Americans did not merely bring more ships, more aircraft, more men. They brought a system for making more at a rhythm the battlefield could feel. A general does not have to love his opponent to respect that. He only has to counting. For the army meant admitting that shipping decided everything in the archipelagos. The numbers that broke hearts were not myths. They were tenacious. Convoys that once threaded gaps at night found radar and patrol aircraft waiting. The old promise that boldness could hide a ship in darkness failed against an enemy that lit the ocean with range, radio, and patience. What generals began to say to their colonels was severe but clean. We no longer plan around exceptions. We plan around what is likely. If it is likely that ships will be sunk, then garrisons must be written into plans as if they will not be resupplied. That is not fatalism. That is logistics, speaking truth. The truth demanded that every fortification double as a cellar, every trench as storage, every defensive belt as a rationing system. In such a world, waste became a sin punishable not by court-martial but by hunger. They also learned to read the enemy's calendar. American operations did not bloom from nowhere. They followed a preparation cycle that left fingerprints: reconnaissance, engineering build-up, rehearsal, synchronized fire, and then exploitation, guarded by maintenance. The officers who compared New Guinea to the Marianas and then to the Philippines stopped talking about bad luck and started talking about predictable tempo against tempo. Showy gestures die against tempo only. Frictions matter. Weather, terrain, deception that forces changes at the last minute, and the fatigue that reaches even well-supplied men when terrain turns every 100 meters into an argument. The army could not cancel an invasion. It could, at best, mistime it by making the invader doubt his own clock. When generals wrote economy of fire, they were not saving bullets for some abstract. They were saving them for the hour when fire could push the enemy's schedule into tomorrow. A theme that rose in these final years, then that remains the truest pivot of their thinking, was the shift from symmetrical ambition to deliberate asymmetry. In 1942, men taught to admire shock believed in strokes that shattered lines. By late 1944, the same men told their brigadiers to treasure invisibility more than audacity. Audacity without ammunition is theater. Invisibility with ammunition is power. That sentence is not romantic. It is staff work in a single breath. It explains Kurabayashi's tunnels and Yamashita's refusals to spend blood on gestures. The fixation on night and on ranges where a single machine gun could do the work of a platoon if the enemy had to cross a ravine that funneled him. It explains why silence, so humiliating to young fighters who wanted to shoot, became a weapon that multiplied itself at will. In Tokyo, as Ketsugo took shape, the Army's seniors held on to one more professional instinct that reveals how they thought about American power. They separated respect for the enemy's method from fear of the enemy's will. Method can be counted. Will can change. If any hinge remained, it lay where those to meet. The generals who signed the orders did not write fairy tales about willpower defeating steel. They wrote about pain and time-shaping decisions in a democracy that counted both. Their target was not the enemy's courage. It was the enemy's, the invisible partner of every convoy and every landing schedule. The doctrine that grew from this is why their orders obsess about where to preserve ammunition, which edges of ridges to mine, which crossroads to hold even if everything else must bend. They were not trying to win a duel. They were trying to teach the enemy that the duel would take too long. In the final months, those ideas confronted realities at home that exposed, again, why American power had weighed so heavily. Urban firestorms turned logistics into a domestic emergency. The Army's ability to feed and move men at the moment of invasion would depend on cities that no longer produced at the necessary pace, on rails repaired by crews who had not slept, on communications that worked until they did not. Generals writing to district commanders started sounding like municipal managers because they had to protect water, cache fuel, disperse stocks to deny a single point of failure. The practical tone does not diminish the military purpose. It reveals it. If a soldier can drink, his rifle has a future. If a truck can find gasoline, an ambush exists. The other side of these memos is their humility professionals, bowing to the knowledge that no amount of careful verbs can conjure factories. When surrender arrived, some of the officers who had written those memos were dead by their own hand. Men who believed that their duty's shape ended with their lives. Others, still breathing, signed their names under terms they had never imagined accepting, because nothing remained that could promise their soldiers more than another week of dying. In the interrogations and post-war volumes that followed, the pattern of their admissions can sound cold to outsiders. Acknowledgements that the enemy's air superiority grew from a training system, not a sudden miracle. That naval mastery grew from oil and shipyards, and from a learning navy, not a lucky fleet. That ground success grew from artillery coordination and radios that worked even when companies were tired. Such sentences do not stir parades. They do something better. They teach. What did these generals say, in the end, about American power once it became impossible to ignore? They said it loudly enough in the orders they wrote and in the doctrines they adapted that their soldiers could hear it without speeches. They said, "Do not shoot because you want to. Shoot when geometry makes it count." They said, "Do not think of the sea as a friend. Think of it as weather sometimes calm, often deadly, never yours to command." They said, "Measure ranges, own the night. Make your positions matter, even if you are alone for a month." They said, "Courage is common, discipline is rare. Spend the rare thing carefully." They said, "The enemy is predictable when he is strong, and predictability is a gift for the patient." These are not sentences designed for memorials. They are sentences meant to keep men alive long enough to make their deaths mean something. If death is what the war still requires, the paradox of their last 2 years is that clear thinking made room for hope, even as the graphs trended downward. Clear thinking allowed for the kind of defenses that bruised an invader's calendar, for ambushes that made headlines, for hills that entered the language of veterans as proofs of endurance. But clarity also prevented the lie that those bruises could change the bones underneath. Every time a general briefed a colonel on economy of fire or dispersion, he was doing two things at once: honoring the craft that had raised them both, and acknowledging the scale that had outgrown that craft. In that double act lies the most honest answer to the title of this story. They spoke about the enemy's power not to flatter him or to excuse themselves, but to align their soldiers with what reality would permit. Power is a fact, before it is a feeling. They taught their armies to live with the fact. Will such honesty matter to audiences far removed from the smoke and dust? It should, because it refuses the lazy myths that comfort and instead offers the practical reverence that soldiers reserve for competence, even in enemies. The American system that overwhelmed Japan did not rest on luck. It rested on a society that fed factories, on officers who cared as much about supply tables as about slogans, and on a habit of maintenance so dull that no novelist celebrates it. Japanese generals, late in the war, became the unwilling chroniclers of these truths. Their grudging respect does not erase the crimes and brutalities committed in theaters where the army had enjoyed its own advantages. Respect is not absolution. It is simply an accurate account of why the battlefield felt the way it did to men who had to count shells in the dark. If one were to condense their final view into a single message for any future officer, it might be this: never mistake theater for power. Power is capacity, organized over time. It is the thing that allows an army to stop for a night and then begin again, as if the day had been a rehearsal. It is the calendar that bends to your will because your depots and workshops have taught it to bend. The Japanese army's seniors learned this the hard way, at a cost that outlived them. They could not manufacture time or steel, but they could, at last, speak clearly about those who could. And in that clarity lies a kind of respect that war rarely teaches in time to matter. As we approach the end of our remembrance today, we're grateful you listened to this full story with us, and we're glad our archive has nourished your heart and soul. War stories have probably also marked your family's life in some way, haven't they? Maybe you wore the uniform yourself, or perhaps someone you loved did. Your father, a grandfather, or even an uncle. If so, we'd like to invite you to add another chapter to this record. Share with our community a war story that resonates in your family in the comments below. It could be a family tale, a saved letter, a lesson learned on a flight line, or in a muddy field. Anything you want. Tell us from where and what time are you listening to this message. This contribution helps to grow and keep our community together. We can't let these incredible stories be lost in time. The World War II Archives channel was created to honor and preserve these memories. Finally, if this resonates with you, we invite you to subscribe and perhaps share it with a friend who also recognizes the importance of these tales. Stay tuned so you don't miss the next one of our lost archives yet to come.